Good evening, good afternoon, good morning to everybody joining us for this really important webinar that's part of the Asia Thinker series organized by the Kuan Youth School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. My name is Ben Kashor, and I am the Li Ka-shing Professor in Public Management and also the Director of the Initiative on Environment and Sustainability at the Kuan Youth School of Public Policy. I am the chairperson for this series session and the moderator. And today we will have three experts who will discuss food technologies necessary, challenging, or unique. As all of you know, you don't need to be reminded, we live in highly disruptive times. Rising concerns of food protectionism, food shortages, and of course, the overarching effects of climate change continue to impact us more directly than ever before. I'm looking therefore very forward to hearing what our panelists have to say as we do a deep dive together into this really important topic. Now, for our virtual participants, I also invite you to join our conversation. Right after we have a moderated discussion, you can answer two poll questions that we'll be having during this session. Also, don't forget to send us your questions for the Q&A period later on. And please refer to the chat message if you are on Zoom or the comment box if you are on Facebook Live for instructions. Now, what we're going to do now is I'm going to introduce our three speakers individually to begin to kick off our conversation. And then I will ask each speaker consecutively to give a 6 to 7 minute opening set of comments about these really important challenges. Following that, we'll have a moderated conversation. Then we'll have our very exciting poll where you get to actually give your feedback on some questions we want you to answer, followed by then a Q&A of your questions that you pose regarding these important topics. So with that, it is an honor for me to formally introduce the first of our three speakers, all of whom bring a vast experience and research knowledge on our topic. So first, we welcome Dr. Rosa Rowe, who is a Senior Enterprise Development Officer in the Food and Nutrition Division of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, headquartered in Rome, where she leads a team working on the enhancement of food system sustainability with a specific focus on reducing food loss and waste. She provides oversight to FAO's technical platform on the measurement and reduction of food loss and waste, and also leads FAO's awareness-raising efforts and initiatives through the global observance of the International Day of the Awareness of Food Loss and Waste. During her tenure as Senior Agro-Industry and Post-Harvest Officer at FAO's Regional Office for Asia and Pacific from 2009 to 2015, she also led the design and implementation of the Save Food Asia Pacific campaign, where she authored or co-authored a number of developmentally focused technical resources on food processing and packaging and on post-harvest systems of management. I could go on and on. Let me just say finally that she holds an MSc and PhD degrees in food science from the Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio, and will be speaking about what types of food processing technologies would be best recommended to support agri-food system transformation in the region, and where should the emphasis be placed. So with that, Dr. Rowe, we welcome you to give the first set of opening comments.
Thank you very much, Ben. Good afternoon. And first of all, I'd like to say thank you to the organizers for inviting a contribution from FAO. As was highlighted, I will talk about the processing technologies from a sustainable perspective. If we were living in an ideal world today, our food systems would be resilient, they would be inclusive, which means everybody would be able to afford and access food, sustainable, and they would be producing enough nutritious food for all, generating livelihoods that guarantee people's economic access to food. But this is not the case. In fact, the next slide, please. Until the end of the 20th century, the main objective of the food processing industry was to lower the cost of food, with very little attention to addressing sustainability issues. Today, however, consumption patterns and agri-food systems are contributing to high rates of food loss and waste, greenhouse gas emissions, environmental pollution, degradation of our natural ecosystems, and biodiversity loss, and indeed also a growing source of inequality. So assuring compliance with safety principles, sustainability principles, is now an imperative for the food processing sector globally. Increasing the availability and affordability of healthy, sustainable food options toward assuring food security and nutrition is a very important and critical issue. And toward meeting these objectives, the sector brings in a focus on resource efficiency in terms of water and energy use in processing operations, minimizing waste through optimization of in-plant operations, and also the recovery and circularity of waste. And I'd now like to highlight a few strategic approaches that can be effective at different levels of operation. When food processing energy typically accounts for as much as, food processing energy in processing energy typically accounts for as much as 10% of the cost of processing operations worldwide. And therefore, we have to work toward helping to design or to redesign technologies to become more energy efficient so that we can actually help to work toward reducing the cost of food and the operations involved in producing that food, and through enhancing the efficiency of the various processes. Here we see one example of a very simple processing operation that is widely employed in many different regions of the globe, which is drying to preserve food. And if we can redesign some simple technologies of this type to increase their efficiency, such as in the case of the solar dryers, where we see increasing operational redesign. This is one example for example, being done in Pakistan, where they've converted the solar dryer, and we see them across many countries in the Asian region, to a tunnel system that helps to increase and speed up the rate of drying, give you a better quality product as well as a safer product. Another approach to be targeted is the sustainability of the energy sources that are used to generate electricity for food processing operations. Currently, in many food processing operations, carbon-based energy sources are the main source of electricity, and they contribute to global warming because they produce high levels of greenhouse gases. So we have to look at options for using renewable sources of energy for the production of electricity. And to a large extent, what we've been seeing happening in many countries across the globe is the use of hydroelectricity, but also the wind, through the establishment of windmill farms to supply electricity. And many large companies are actually taking up these types of initiatives, setting up the farms, and that gives them credits in terms of their sustainability activities. And also, we have to look more at innovation. And according to McKinsey & Company, if consumers were able replace between 10% and 15% of the meat they consume with alternative proteins by 2030, the total greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture could drop by between 5% and 8%. Freshwater withdrawals for agriculture could be reduced by between 7% and 12%, and between 5% and 10% of the total land use for agriculture could be freed up for other uses. And looking through the literature, I note that the consumption of many of these products is already it's very common in Singapore, and of course, they're not the types of products that are easily accessible by everyone. So again, of course, when we're looking at these issues, these are considerations that we have to make on what level of technology for which type of consumer and how it's used. And we will always have to work across a gradient. And then the other issue that we have to address is to manage that waste. And the upcycling of unavoidable food waste, for example, into food products is a growing industry that is taking place now. And a lot of that is being done through the establishment of collaborative types of initiatives and activities between different types of processing operations. For example, you see a lot of food products, I've shown one on the slide here, that are used that are produced from byproducts of food processing through upcycling. And from a financial perspective, it promises the food industry the opportunity to benefit through value creation. Also, you're generating new products and as well as a cleaner environment. But of course, move to the use of these types of technologies necessitates investments in technologies, in research, and infrastructure. But there is a growing movement across the globe where these products are really being taken up because also they cost less, and they also because of the sustainability concerns of where customers would like to see more of this being taken up. And then we have a number of emerging green technologies. Then these tend to be very high-level technologies that are costly, and a lot of them still have been piloted in a number of areas, but has not yet been actually implemented because of the cost of the operation. A lot of these products, again, would be of high cost, but we have to look at all the different options when we're looking at ways to maximize the use and the preservation of food. The food processing technologies, I think, are necessary because we have to preserve our food to assure food security and nutrition. They are unique in terms of the adaptability of the types of, how they can be adapted very easily to different scenarios, for different cultures, for different tastes, how easy you could use slightly different, introducing different types of simple innovations that can have a big impact on the quality of the food. And they are challenging because they require a lot of research and innovation, as well as a lot of investment requirements if we are to ensure their sustainability. So successfully moving towards sustainability in food processing operations, we have to look at supportive policies. We need investments in technologies and a range of different technologies. We need to look at the issue of expansion of infrastructure to support some of the innovative operations. This whole issue of circularity now that is actually coming into place, we have to be ready to support that type of work. And then, of course, we have most of and foremost to address the issues of consumers, because their behavior, consumers increasingly demand more information concerning the sustainability of the food that they consume. Thank you very much. This concludes my presentation.
Thank you so much for those really fascinating opening remarks that link so clearly the importance of consumer behavior, technology, along with the scientific knowledge around how we can reduce food system waste and our own engagement with the natural world. So we look forward to asking many questions that follow up from that opening set of comments. I'm very pleased to introduce our next speaker, Ms. Po Beilang, who is Director of Agri-Technology and Food Innovation of the Agri-Technology and Food Innovation Department within the Urban Food Solutions Division at the Singapore Food Agency. In her position, she plans and oversees the research and development support that SFA provides to assist local vegetable farms to improve their productivity and achieve higher yields. She also assists and facilitates the entry of new urban vegetable farms in the industry. Beilang has over 20 years of experience working in the local vegetable industry. Her current research areas include urban farming, genetics, sustainable inputs, and waste management, and pest management. She graduated with a degree in biology from the National University of Singapore and obtained a master's degree in horticultural science from the University of Florida in the United States. And today she'll be speaking about the Singapore food story. Welcome very much, Beilang.
Thank you, Ben. Good afternoon, everyone. I thought it would be useful to give some context to the audience about Singapore by sharing this overview of the Singapore food story. Next, please. Next, yeah. The Singapore Food Agency, SFA, was formed in April 2019 with a mission to ensure and secure a supply of safe food. By having oversight of the entire food supply chain from farm to fork, SFA is able to strengthen Singapore's food safety and supply. Next. As a small city-state with limited resources, Singapore is vulnerable to the global food situation where supply may not be able to keep up with demand. On one hand, population growth coupled with increasing incomes drives food demand. On the other hand, urbanization competes with agriculture for land and puts growing pressure on the already scarce agricultural resources. And this is exacerbated by climate change, which increases the frequency of extreme weather events and adversely impacts production yields. In addition to this uncertainty in ensuring sufficient supply to meet demand, the world is also facing increasing food safety risk. Food business models, technologies, and products are evolving, and food supply chains are getting more complex. All this may pose higher food safety risk. Next. To ensure that Singapore has a supply of safe food, we do not depend on just one strategy alone. SFA developed the Singapore Food Story, which comprises 3 strategies termed the 3 food baskets. I will talk more about them in the subsequent slides. Next. The first basket is grow local or local production. Local production builds capability to produce more food for Singapore in times of need. In the past, Singapore was able to grow a lot of our own food. Today, we have around 250 food farms producing a small amount of what we consume. Fish and vegetable farms form the bulk of these farms. Next. On Grow Local, we developed the ambitious 30 by 30 goal, which is to build our capability and capacity to sustainably produce 30% of our nutritional needs locally by 2030. Local production helps to buffer against food supply disruptions, mitigate impacts of climate change and resource constraints, and close the production loop for us in the long run. And this is done through leveraging technologies and innovations. To achieve this, we are committed to developing Singapore's capability and capacity in the following areas. Next, please. First, companies will require the right spaces and infrastructure to operate in. Therefore, we work with other government agencies to identify, plan, and develop land, sea, industrial, and alternative spaces to match supply with industry demand. Next. Second, we want to do more to plug the gaps where existing technologies cannot achieve. This is where R&D plays a key role. We have developed a comprehensive R&D program covering 3 broad areas: sustainable urban food production, advanced biotech protein production, and food safety, science, and innovation. The government has allocated up to $144 million to provide funding support to implement this program. Collectively, this will help to achieve Singapore's 30 by 30 goal through increasing food productivity, developing technologies for alternative protein production, and enhancing food safety capabilities within Singapore's ecosystem. Next, please. Lastly, we facilitate the growth of the sector and the ecosystem through creating a pro-enterprise environment, developing a manpower talent pipeline to support the growing industry, which is something very important. We do want to attract the youth to come into our industry. And finally, we do establish a strong Singapore branding through the Choose Fresh SG local produce logo for local food production companies to strengthen their market presence and access. Next. Our second food basket is to diversify import sources. With many competing users of land in Singapore, we rely heavily on food imports. And we must diversify our sources to ensure that our food supply is resilient to global food supply fluctuations. To do this, we explore and accredit more import sources so that the industry can have diversification in their sources. We also introduce the industry to new food sources through sourcing trips and business networking sessions. Additionally, we work with the importers to adopt plans to mitigate against supply disruptions. Next, moving on, our third and last food basket is growing overseas. If our companies can invest overseas, they will be able to overcome land and manpower constraints and access new and bigger overseas markets. This allows them to bring down costs through economies of scale. Growing overseas also increases the food production of the partnering country and opens up the potential for these local companies to export their produce back to Singapore. This brings me to the end of the presentation. Thank you.
I think I can now speak, but my monitor is not on, so I'll speak as long as you can hear me. That's fine, or the main monitor anyway. Yeah, thank you very much for those comments. Really interesting and compelling case that in the case of Singapore, the local food movement is not just around the idea one should buy local for sustainable reasons, but also because, of course, for security reasons too. And this is not always the case for other urban areas. So very fascinating interaction of problem definitions around a really important issue. So we'll come back to some questions on that. Before we get to the questions, our final speaker, it is my pleasure to welcome is my colleague from the Kuan School of Public Policy here at NUS, Assistant Professor Sonia Akhter. Her research is multifaceted. She's highly prolific, and she works at the nexus of agriculture, the environment, and development in the Asia Pacific region. She has worked extensively on agricultural and food policy, natural disasters, and women's empowerment in South and Southeast Asia, and brings perspectives around then what to do with this knowledge for improving the policy process and policy impacts in the region as well. She graduated with a PhD in environmental management and development from the Australian National University in 2010 and holds an MS degree in economics from York University in Canada, my home country. And she'll discuss the role today of emerging technologies in managing the impacts of food protectionism, particularly on a highly important dependent country like Singapore. So with that, Sonia, welcome.
Thank you very much, Ben. Hello, everybody. Good evening. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'll wait for my slides. Okay, great. So my opening remark is about the role of emerging technologies in managing the impacts of food protectionism in Singapore. Next, please. So let me first briefly talk about what food protectionism is. So food protection is a phenomenon when major food exporting countries impose a restriction on their food export in the international market. So these restrictions can come in different forms. It can be like a complete ban on food export, or like some kind of a quota, or countries can impose a very high tax on food export, or governments can also impose a minimum export price. So food export protectionism is a strategy that governments use to protect the local consumers from a food price hike. So this diagram that in my slide shows the magnitude and the duration of the three major food protectionism waves that we have witnessed in the last 20 years. So during COVID-19 pandemic, as you can see that the magnitude and the duration, both magnitude and the durations were low compared to the two other food crisis or protectionism event. During the 2007-8 food crisis, both the magnitude and the duration was much longer. So in terms of, when I say magnitude, I mean the percentage of food trade, global food trade in terms of calories that were affected by the export restriction. So, and also in terms of duration, as you can see that the restrictions was continued for quite some time. And now the ongoing crisis, during this ongoing crisis, we can also see that the magnitude is quite comparable and as high as the 2007-8 food crisis. For duration, we'll have to wait some time to see how long these restrictions remain in place. Next, please. So food protectionism is not a good thing for a country like Singapore, which is highly dependent on import for its food supply. So such food protectionism can increase international food prices, and they can then cost a lot of money for a country like Singapore to buy food, and then it can also increase the contribute to local food inflation. So there are several strategies. This is a roadmap of strategies that Singapore government uses to strengthen its food system resilience. So I'll talk about some places where technology can play a role in improving the Singapore's food system resilience and Singapore's food self-sufficiency. Next, please. So let's talk about agri-food technology. So there is a lot of discussion about alternative protein, particularly in the wake of the chicken ban imposed by the Malaysian government on chicken export to the rest of the world, and Singapore was directly affected because a third of Singapore's chicken import comes from Malaysia. So interest in alternative protein is increasing, and particularly the Singaporean consumers are feeling very optimistic with the so this technology, this food technology grows meat from plant cell, cellular meat using plant cell or animal cell in a lab. So this is also alternatively known as lab grown meat. And Singapore has been very pragmatic about these types of new technologies. Singapore has been among the very first countries that approved the commercial sale of lab-grown meat in Singaporean market. So these are all very good, important steps in the right direction, and there is a potential of such technology to contribute in Singapore's food self-sufficiency in the future. But what is important for us to keep in mind is that these technologies are at a very, very nascent stage. There is lots of unknown, and there's a lot that we have to know about this technology, whether consumer prefer this technology over the regular meat, whether consumer can accept such lab-grown technology, and also their affordability. I think that's the most important part, is whether such meat grown from these technologies would be affordable for the regular consumers. But in the meantime, what we can do is to diversify our diet by diversifying our protein sources, and as well as carbohydrate sources, by using other food products that are already available in the market, which are very cheap and also quite easy to access. Next, please. Okay. So food waste reduction is another very important area. There's a lot of potential where we can save a lot of food. And so food waste reduction was always very important, but it makes more economic sense now than ever before, now that food is not abundant and food is very expensive. By investing in food waste reduction, we can make a lot of difference at the national level as well as at the household level. So investment in technologies such as food biotechnology that can improve the shelf life of food products, that can be a very important way of improving food waste reduction or minimizing food waste. Other areas where investment can be made is road transport, packaging, and storage. So with this infrastructure improvement, wastage will be further reduced. And also at the household level, at the consumer level, changing consumer behavior by making small steps. So this doesn't require like big changes in your life and behavior. Making very small steps in proper planning, mindful shopping, storing the food properly, preparing and consuming the food properly can make a huge saving in households' budget. So I'll stop here, and then we can discuss further during the question answer session as well as the moderation session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Srija, and to all three speakers for bringing us really important analyses about security, food, and technology dynamics behind this important policy problem. So to get the ball rolling, I'm going to ask some questions about, as you could imagine, given we're in a policy school, the policy aspects of these stories that the three of you have nicely told. And I'm going to ask the question to all of you, and then I'll have each of you come back and respond to my questions. But the first question is directed at Dr. Role, and really intrigued about the way in which efficiency, technology, and consumers reducing or changing their protein sources can have a really important impact on the problems you're looking at FAO. I'm curious about then your comment on what individuals can do. And this is always a challenge vexing governments, is what level do you target the policy authority to make changes? Should it be government itself directing through command and control regulations some kind of behavioral change or some kind of economic incentive? Or should it be given to either corporations or individuals who might innovate in ways to also make a difference? And when we think of consumers, we tend to think individuals, but of course, you can always regulate consumers as well. So my question is, what do you think, and what is the FAO finding about what are the most effective levers to think about where these choices ought to be made, individual or corporate or government levels? That's my question for you. And then, but likewise, a similar question on the Bileng's presentation, then on the really fascinating issue of both the idea of local production being useful for sustainable reasons, but of course also the issues, as also Sonia raised, about security. And I'm wondering, therefore, in the context of Singapore and efforts to foster behaviors that could reinforce food security, where again are the best levers to do this? Is it, for example, advertising to individuals what they can do to change their behaviors? Or is it more appropriate to sort of develop regulations that can apply to all of Singaporean society? And likewise, in the context of you discussing the really fascinating track about getting companies to invest overseas to maintain more food supply, how would that work exactly? Because of course, those companies operating elsewhere in the world outside of Singapore are still subject to the host government's rules. And you could imagine they could therefore, if they wanted to, these governments block, as Sonia's already identified, imports back into Singapore. So how would that work? Would there be some kind of perhaps contractual agreement with Singapore and the host country, or would it just be hoped that this might develop on its own? And then finally, to Sonia's point again too, who also walked really nicely through these interaction between food export bans and consumer behavior. And by the way, I was so struck about the whole chicken rice ban issue and how important that was as somebody new to Singapore, and I know how important chicken rice is. I couldn't believe that for a while there, you would have to have frozen chicken instead of fresh chicken and chicken rice dishes. So I'm wondering, therefore, again, you talked about diversifying diets, changing consumer behavior, and finding a way to address this protectionism. So two-part question for you. One is, what if these efforts to protect food domestically and therefore causing these trade problems are actually very temporary? And that therefore we don't want to respond in a long-term way to what will become temporary problems that may not be an issue in a couple of years. And if that's the case, how do we know whether this is a temporary phenomenon owing to COVID or a long-term result of COVID and those kinds of effects? And then finally, again, where do you target consumer behavior? Do you target regulation? How do you actually handle these problems? So, okay, wide-ranging questions around where do we go, what level to generate policy choices. And let's start with Dr. Roles to start.
Okay, thank you. On the issue of policies and I think where should we be targeting? I think what I believe is that the governments have an important role to play in terms of providing an enabling environment that would allow the private sector to continue to do what they need to do, because we need that capacity to process. But there are certain areas and elements that need to be regulated when it comes to food safety. For example, it's something that has to be regulated, and this is where you really need government support. Consumers have, I think, consumers are the people that have to eat that food. And so the consumers should not be regulated. They now increasingly what we're seeing is consumer movements are actually really making a significant impact in terms of helping to support that drive to sustainability. And that in itself is also very important if we want to begin to really start to see the transformation of our food systems, because consumers need to have access to nutritious food, and everyone is now concerned about the environment and as we see it. So I think target setting in terms of helping to ensure the safety of food. There are certain areas, yes, that should be regulated, but and also we're providing an enabling environment that allows the private sector to be able to establish the systems that are needed in place to be able to achieve some of the sustainability requirements to produce the food that is required by consumers. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And that really resonates even in the work we're doing at the Kuan School of Public Policy, bringing different disciplines together about understanding what's the best policy mix. There's not a single answer to this question, but what's the best mix to lead to important behavioral changes? And so your answer really resonates. Thank you for that. Beiling, so how do you answer this question about regulation and where to go?
Hi. So regulations, if we are looking at consumers, I think like what Dr. Rosa has said, that we need to work together. I mean, government has a role in regulations and setting certain regulations to allow, let's say, for example, like the cultured meat, right? That's what the government has done to set the regulations to allow the production of cultured meat. But the consumers will also, I mean, there's the industry who will be doing the production. They have a role there, and doing it in the best way they could, and then getting that volume up. And of course, the consumers will have a role as well, and they must be prepared to appropriate to adopt appropriate measures. For example, like SFA, we encourage our consumers to follow these ABC tips, right? So you buy what you need and do not over purchase for the food that you're going to buy. This is about reducing the food wastage. Be flexible and adaptable with your protein options. That is for the chicken. Maybe you cannot get your chicken, you could try fish. And then of course you could choose alternatives such as frozen or processed chicken for the interim that you have to address, while the government also tried their best to address the issue together with the industry. Yeah, I think this is in relation to the chicken ban issue. So definitely, we think there is a joint. We have to work jointly together between the government, industry, and consumers.
Yeah, thank you very much. And again, I appreciate that nuanced answer about multiple ways to create these changes that are so important for long-term food security. Okay, over to Sonia for your reaction to those questions.
Yeah, I have a question to you, Ben. If chicken rice is cooked with frozen chicken, would you know? Can you tell?
You know, I don't know if I could tell her. I'm Canadian. I'm still learning about this kind of stuff, but I try. My guess is I would probably eventually know the difference.
Okay, the key is flexibility here. So the thing is, for a food importing country like Singapore, Singapore's one of the strategies was to diversify its imports, right? So if your imports is diverse, then if one country stops or there's a production, shock, then the country can move to, then Singapore can move to another trading partner to import food. But when there's a global decline in food production, so that might, sometimes the diversification of import is probably not going to be the most, effective strategy to improve or maintain the food system resilience. So the idea is to also diversify the food diet, diversify the sources of protein, diversify the sources of carbohydrate, so that we are not too much dependent on one commodity. So if it is, chicken, there's a shortage of chicken, we can switch to alternative protein like plant-based protein, pulses and beans and tofu and other things, as well as fish, as Beiling mentioned, like fish or frozen chicken. So that as a consumer, if you're more flexible, that will improve our food system resilience. Then it will not make us unhappy consumers, because we are more adaptable, we are more flexible, we can switch to other commodities if one commodity becomes very expensive and one commodity is not available, then we are not like becoming undissatisfied and like spending a huge share of our budget to purchase that commodity. So that if we are flexible, then that will also ease the pressure on domestic prices of food commodities. And in international market, we know that whenever there is an export ban, import of international food price goes up, and the food importing countries suffer the most as a result. During the 2007-8 food crisis, research shows that 30% for rice and 40% for wheat of the increased price could be explained purely by export restriction. So export restriction clearly exacerbates the food price crisis. So this also during this crisis, we can see that the day India announced ban on wheat export, wheat prices skyrocketed on that particular day. So, and if as an import dependent country, if consumers are more flexible, then that helps to manage the food system resilience and makes us a very resilient country.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just a quick follow-up too, because you work on technology, and we know that that can play a mediating role in these two dimensions, protectionism and then diversity of behavioral consumption. How does technology play out in your story here? I mean, on one hand, all this blockchain technology now is doing something in all these different systems. On the one hand, there are barriers to technological innovations. How do those things play out in this story right now in today's world?
Okay, so blockchain is a new technology, and currently up until I think 2002, 2003, 2022, 2023, the global value of blockchain technology in agri and food industry is around $200 million. But the forecast is that by 2028, the global value of blockchain technology in food and agriculture market will exceed $1 billion. So when the blockchain technology first introduced in the agriculture and food check system, then the major benefit of this technology is considered that traceability and consumer trust, that we can trace our food and the consumer can also trust where the food is coming from. They can also see it. But as the use of the technology is growing, particularly during the COVID-19 phase, when there was a huge supply chain disruption, we got to learn about other benefits of this technology. And the most important benefit of using blockchain technology in times of supply chain disruption is that this technology can improve the supply chain efficiency of agri-food system by reducing the transaction cost of interaction among the food system actors. So because this revolutionized the way the information is exchanged, information is shared, contracts are made, and that can also reduce market fragmentation as well as the cost of getting in touch of different actors in the food system. So to give you an example, so if during COVID-19, what happened was there was like export restriction, left, right, and center. People were canceling the existing agreements with the trading partners. But then if the blockchain throughout the blockchain system, the buyers can connect to another supplier quite quickly if they are part of the blockchain ecosystem. But the problem is that currently, as I said, the overall share network is very small. But as the network grows, as more and more countries and suppliers, get connected through blockchain technology, the supply chain efficiency will increase over time. And during the time of disruption, this technology can be very, very useful.
Okay, yeah, that's a fascinating technology and disruption interact in ways that can help society. Is fascinating observation. We're going to get to the poll questions in a moment, but before we do that, I just want to do a quick follow-up to our other two speakers, Dr. Rosa Rosale and Beleng, and ask you, in your cases, in your world, what would you identify as a very promising technology that might help address the food security challenges each of you are addressing so nicely? So maybe we'll start with Dr. Role.
In terms of food technologies, I think what we need to be looking for is technologies that are adaptable, and the technologies that cover a broad spectrum of opportunities, rather than investing in very high specific technologies. We have to look at a very broad spectrum and focus in and maybe on the needs of the consumers, because we have a broad spectrum of affordability that has to be considered if we want to look at food security. So some of the basic technologies that we actually use today are fantastic. And all we need to do is to work on them a little bit more to improve their efficiency. And that's one of the reasons why I showed the solar technology, because drying was a traditional technology. Now it's just by innovating drying options, there's a lot that can be done. And it's a very good base for going into a number of different products. So we have to, I think, that type of looking into what is possible adaptability and the options that one can go to with a dried product.
Thank you. That's a fascinating answer. It isn't just new technologies per se, but using existing ones in ways that are innovative. So very much appreciate that. Yeah, so Bei-Ling, I know you talked about technology, but in your perspective, what's like a real promising one of all the ones out there in your world?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I focus on urban farming, especially about vegetable production. We are a small country with limited resources, and we want to grow more with less. You heard about our 30 by 30 very ambitious goal, and we think that we can only achieve this through technology and innovation as our key enablers. So we are seeing that we also expect that probably a significant amount of our local production to be produced from multi-tier vertical type of farming systems using controlled environment agriculture, where we could get more precise control of the environmental conditions to optimize our use. And this is something that I observed in our farming industry over the years. Like I said, 20 years ago, we still have conventional soil-based agriculture, and today we are seeing a growing proportion of farms in indoor systems, multi-tier, because we basically have to work around our limitations, and this is something very promising for us here in Singapore. Thank you.
Interesting too, you mentioned limitations. In fact, I mean, the story of Singapore is one of advancing technological innovations because it is a small city state and needed to do that to survive, right? So ironically, limitations also create then the strengths with which to then address these problems. So very fascinating. Okay, so now we're going to do our poll. Before the results are announced, I'm going to read the questions first. And then it seems that the results will flash on your screen. They already are flashing on your screen. Okay, so I'm just going to read them anyway. First one, in your opinion, can we rely on technology to solve the future issues of food shortage? A, yes. B, no. C, yes and no. No one size fits all. And D, none of the above. Let's begin with government. So I'm going to just go to the screen here. And yes and no by a long shot. Okay, fascinating. And that kind of reflects the themes of our discussion today. That it's the policy mix that can help think about both leveraging individual and corporate efforts, but around some kind of public vision that is going to be the most effective way to address these problems. But you've got to bring in knowledge around technology, the latest science, and so on to do so. Okay, so thank you, audience, for that. Overwhelming on C. Question number 2. In your opinion, what might hinder the progress of and development of food technology? A, training and education. B, infrastructure. C, financing investments in the economy. And D, social issues. So go to our screen again, and we got a bit more of a diversity of responses, although I see that infrastructure takes 44%, and then financing 31%. And yeah, and of course, social issues matter, right? Because if you don't understand and incorporate the cultural dynamics, policy can't be effective. Interesting about training and education. I would think that, when it comes to food systems, training how to then grow intensively produced food would be an important part of the story, but the audience feels that that's not as important as the other ones. So fascinating. I'm not going to get the panelists' reaction to those polls. If we can just ponder them, because now we've got some questions from the audience we want to get to in our remaining time, which sure does fly in these interesting and important conversations. So I'm going to raise two questions first, both from Raymond Tam. And Raymond asks the following two questions. First, many upcycling initiatives fail because of producer expectations on prices, the costs of transportation, and storage and trade monopolies on supply chains. Given this, his question is, how can we overcome these kinds of challenges? And then two, as we have seen with the recent chicken export ban by Malaysia, or chicken rice case, how can the third basket that is growing overseas, so this is to Biling's point, how can the third basket of the Singapore's 30 by 30 plan be reliable? Okay, so I'll start there, and let's go in order of the way you all spoke initially. So we'll begin with Dr. Pole.
Okay, thank you. On the upcycling issue, what we see happening increasingly is these types of operations require some measure of collaboration. And that's what is happening, because initially, a lot of these types of issues were problems, but with proper private-public collaboration and the scale of the operation with which this is being implemented makes a big difference. And so it's, of course, this technology, this whole system of operation is new. And I think over time, there will be a lot of these kinks need to be worked out. Now, I mean, we've been working before the name of upcycling was coined. FAO has been working along those lines for many years. And we have, there are always issues related to consolidation of that waste. And so scale is a very important factor in terms of, and then of course, how you manage that whole new supply chain that needs, and these are some of the things I think over time really need to be studied and looked at in terms of feasibility, cost, and to really have some very efficient. We do see some examples that are really working well at this time, but I think when you start working at a country level, these are the things that one has to pilot to get to the point where you can look at the efficiency gains. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Belang, over to you.
Yeah. I mean, we have to recognize that actually our primary strategy is on import diversification, and this has worked well all these years. Even for this, the current case with the chicken ban, we work closely with the industry, and we managed to manage it quite well. I would say the industry were able to activate their stockpiles, their other contacts in supply. So for the Grow Overseas basket, it's not exactly to address specific food bans or anything, but I would say it just add on to the diversification portfolio. The idea is really that if we have certain technologies or certain local growers who wants to expand, and they could expand it overseas, so there will be greater traction because they have established the market channels. So for them to ship it back to Singapore, they will have easier channels to do so, whereas they can enjoy the benefits of maybe a lower cost of production in the overseas farm. Right? So that's the thinking behind is a way to diversify again, but diversify in a very structured way with our own local growers.
Yeah, that's actually very helpful. A multitude of interventions on an overall overarching effort, so that any one source that becomes depleted wouldn't matter as much over time or in the short run. Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. Yeah, Sonia, over to you.
Which question?
That question we had from our first speaker, from Raymond. I mean, he was basically asking about upcycling initiatives could fail because of all of these structural challenges along the supply chain. But maybe I'll just put this to you a bit differently too, Sonia, which is if it's the case that these latest protectionist efforts are temporary, okay, let's just say they are, I'm wondering whether the technology might play a different role in this story. I think you mentioned in your comments that some technologies allow us to store food longer, whereas things like doing things that might lead to long-term changes may not be actually as useful if it is a temporary phenomenon. So is that possibly one way out of this challenge, that you actually focus on some technology to store grains and beans and rice for, let's say, 2 years instead of 6 months, versus imposing policies that might actually create more problems in the long run by making them sort of more durable than temporary themselves?
Okay, so in terms of duration, I showed that comparison of the three food crisis waves that we have experienced, and we see that for during COVID it was relatively short term. 2007-8, those bans were longer term, longer duration, and this time we don't know how long this will continue. But all signs suggest that we are in this for a long haul. Because of the fertilizer crisis. So what the fertilizer crisis is going to do is it is going to affect production this cropping season, this upcoming cropping season. So last cropping season, the production in the rest of the world was relatively normal. So that means the production supply in the next year will go down, because unless we can find a solution of the fertilizer supply shortage or fertilizer price hike. Okay, answering your question about the role of technology. So one of the strategies countries use on a regular basis, even when there is no food shortage, even when there is no food crisis, is stockpiling. So every country, including India, Bangladesh, even the food growing countries, do stockpile for crisis. It can be, the crisis can be something like a natural disaster, or like COVID crisis, for example. So during COVID, people didn't have access to income, although food availability was affected during COVID because it was a health shock. So food was available, but people didn't have purchasing power to access the food. So this was a crisis, even though there was no physical shortage of food. So government then had to cast its social protection net much wider and broader than they usually would do. So government need food stockpile, sufficient stockpile to be able to support these social protection programs. So Singapore and even all the developed countries, they maintain certain stockpiles on a regular basis. So some countries are considering to increase the stockpiling. And when you're stockpiling, certain commodities are easy to stockpile and certain commodities are not. Like dry commodities that food crops that contain less water, like rice, pulses, beans, they are relatively easier to stockpile. So that's another reason why we need diversification, because it not just help us, benefit, but it also helps us to strategize and helps us to stockpile. And the stockpiling is also relatively cheaper when it comes to non-animal source food, because for dry crops commodities, you don't really need much sophisticated storage facilities as opposed to storing, commodities that has high water content like chicken and other commodities.
Okay.
So does it answer your question?
But that does answer the question. It's also informative about how the technology works, but with the different types of foodstuffs, and then what that means for long-term versus short-term. So thank you. There's two questions now I'm going to ask from the audience, and they're fascinating questions because they're both around consumer preferences, but they're also around changes in consumer preferences. And to me, as somebody who studied the environment for a long time, I'm always struck by this dilemma between doing polls to ask what do consumers or individuals feel, but knowing full well that in 10 years, they'll feel differently. And so you can't always base your policy choices on today's preferences when they could change in the future. So how do we handle this dilemma? I think really comes out in these next two questions. So one question is from H.C. Song, and he says, globally, is there now greater acceptance of genetically modified food crops given more frequent food shortages or crop failures? Okay, so really cool question on changing preferences owing to some kind of external event. Awesome question. Can't wait to hear your responses. And then related, Joshua Tan asks, what is the current outlook of consumers' receptiveness towards plant-based and lab-grown meat? And then why do you think Singapore is actively striving to develop this form of food technology? Again, yes, what is the current thinking and approach to these questions? So I'm going to throw it open to all three panelists, and just a recognition that we only have 6 minutes left. Where did the time go? It's an exciting conversation. So please, if you can limit your answers to about 1.5 minutes, that'd be great. But again, over to Dr. Rowley to begin.
In terms of the issue of GM crops, I think people will have to start thinking about these issues more closely as we see what is happening across the globe in terms of food security options today.
Okay, thank you. Nice pithy response. Appreciate that given our time. Over to Beileng.
I will agree with Rosa. Definitely, in the face of food shortages, if you have limited in the choices you have, I guess maybe you eat whatever that is there, so to speak.
Okay, and then Sonia,
Hi. GM crop, as I mentioned about food biotechnology. So this is part of the food biotechnology area. So GM crop, one idea of GM crop is also to modify the crop in a way that it improves the longevity, or shelf life of commodities. So GM crop will be very, very important in terms of improving our food system resilience, because then and also reduce food wastage. So because particularly in low income countries, they don't have infrastructure, they don't have proper storage and proper road and communication. So a lot of food get wasted, and because they can't be stored in a proper temperature and everything. But the technology, that food biotechnology, has the capacity to change the genes and produce food in a way that the food can survive in an adverse condition for a longer period of time. So in terms of food GM crops acceptability, I think it's highly political at the moment, and the information and consumer awareness about the benefits of GM crop as well as their downsides are not very transparent or non-politically communicated yet. So but the acceptance is growing for sure. As far as I'm aware of about the the literature and the trends in other countries, I think the acceptance in GM crop is steadily growing, and the GM crop can play a very important role in food security by reducing food wastage. And what was the second question? It was about consumer acceptance of lab grown versus regular meat.
Exactly. Yeah.
So this is still, I think the lab grown meat is the scale is so small right now that we don't know much information about consumer acceptance yet, but more research needs to be done about consumer preference, consumer perception. What do consumers think about lab grown meat, cultured meat, their nutrition value, their safety standard, and their taste and other things. I think and Singapore should be the one of the country where this type of research is more important, because lab grown meat can play an important role in the future, not maybe in 2-3 months down the line, but 5 to 10 years down the line in Singapore's food self-sufficiency, if this happen to be something that consumers accept and prefer to eat, find like a relatively close substitute of regular meat. So yeah, research should be conducted in Singapore to understand what is necessary to, what are in consumers' mind, and so that when the product is ready, then we can do consumer proper communication and awareness to improve consumers' acceptability of these commodities.
Just a quick observation of the prerogative of the chair. Each of these has fascinating interacting effects with other problem definitions. So of course, the GMO debates are around the possibility that sometime in the future, we might inadvertently create super pests or super bugs that actually come back to really harm our ecosystems. And you can never know for sure. So these debates are also around uncertainty, but also immediate problems and the like that we all have to wrestle with the best we can. But there are these trade-offs. Even if you do solve one problem, you may make another problem worse. And likewise, on the lab-grown one, it's interesting, they're getting really sophisticated now. These burgers, oftentimes, as you know, you can't tell if it's meat or not, but then the increasing energy and other effects to produce that is much higher than just growing a carrot, for example, or a tomato. So how do we understand then preferences to improve lab-based meat that then actually undermine the original problem becomes, I think, an important question that all of you have helped us shed light on by thinking about these multitudinous ways in which we can both address food security and also sustainability. Finally, I would say all of you have said quite nicely that there are though low-lying fruit here, and one is reducing waste. So we know that that's going to be a win-win solution. I spent a fair bit of time in Denmark, which is a very environmentally conscious place. However, there's a culture of not bringing your food home from restaurants, leaving it there. Well, that's embodied carbon that you could have actually, if you brought home, directly had an impact on the world and had no negative trade-offs as a result. And that's also a behavioral question too. So all of you panelists have really nicely brought together the technological, economic, policy dimensions of these questions that are so important for us, both in a post-COVID world, but also in a climate warming world as well. So I would like to have the audience please join me in thanking Dr. Rosa Roll, Ms. B. Po Bilang, and Professor Sonia Akhter for a really wonderful engagement. So first of all, thank you very much. That's going to be my virtual thank you. And then I just want to conclude by saying that please follow us at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy social media channels for our next installment of the Asia Thinker series. As you can tell, these are really informative, important discussions around important matters facing Singapore, ASEAN, and the region. With that, I wish you all a very good end of the week ahead. Take care and be safe. Thank you.